Right. Amanda, the floor is yours.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Amanda Beck from Georgia State University, and I am moderating today's accounting design workshop. And so I'd like to welcome our presenter, Brent Schmidt from Penn State University. He's going to be presenting a study about how the adoption of the current expected credit loss standard by U.S. banks has affected analyst forecasts. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Make sure your microphone is muted if you're not speaking. We encourage you to leave your cameras on just to promote an active and engaged virtual environment. And for questions, please either just use the hand raising function that's on Zoom to raise your hand, or you can ask your question in chat. Brent and I are both going to be keeping an eye on the chat and the hand raising to make sure we get to everybody's questions, but that way we can avoid too many interruptions at one time. And Brent can take questions anytime, but if you can just give him the first 5 minutes or so uninterrupted at the beginning of the presentation, and then he can let us know when he's ready to open the floor for questions. So thanks a lot, and you can take it away.
All right, thanks, Amanda. So again, my name's Brent Schmidt. I'm an assistant accounting professor here at Penn State. Very excited to present at the Accounting Design Project. So first and foremost, want to thank the organizers of the ADP, in particular, Ayung, for helping to kind of coordinate the presentation, and Amanda for agreeing to moderate. So the paper I'm presenting today is the current expected credit loss, or CECL model, and analyst forecasts. So this is co-authored work with Beechin Chi and Sam Bonzel. So as Amanda kind of outlined, I thought I could take the first 5 minutes or so to go over a little bit of background information, just to kind of set up the paper, and then happy to kind of take questions from there. So in terms of the kind of background, just some basic terminology. When we're talking about banks, the allowance for credit losses, this is also known as the credit loss reserves, or the allowance for loan and lease loss, or ALLL. This represents the lender's estimate of uncollectible amounts on loans, and this is a contra asset account. So very analogous to accounts receivable and the allowance for doubtful accounts. And maybe more specific to what we're going to be looking at in this paper is the loan loss provision, which is the income statement account. Essentially, that represents the changes in the allowance during the period after you account for things like charge-offs. But really, the key question is, how are credit losses estimated? So our old GAAP was the incurred loss model, and kind of the new standards, which is the motivation for our study, is the current expected credit loss, or CECL model. So the CECL model was issued in 2016 and first started to be implemented at the beginning of 2020. So what are the differences between the incurred loss model and CECL? So under the incurred loss model, credit losses were only recognized when it was probable that the loss had been incurred as of the balance sheet date. So there seemed to be a too little too late problem, in particular during the 2008 financial crisis. And the idea there was that even though during the financial crisis, banks may have foreseen additional credit losses kind of coming down the road, the accounting standard restricted their ability to incorporate that forward-looking information in their provisioning. And so this problem was widely believed to have exacerbated the 2008 financial crisis. And so there were calls from a lot of stakeholders to change the accounting standards to allow for more timely loan loss recognition. So this is really the impetus for the CECL model, which now requires the recognition of lifetime expected credit losses on loans at the time of origination. So what I have on the screen now is kind of the basic approach that we would take to estimate credit losses for a pool of loans under the incurred loss model. So generally speaking, the way we would estimate those credit losses is we would use the historical loss rates on that pool of loans, and then we may make some adjustments for current economic conditions and other qualitative factors. But again, the key idea here is this information is either based on kind of current information as of the balance sheet date or historical information, but we weren't really allowed to use forward-looking information in coming up with our estimate of credit losses. So CECL came in and changed two main aspects of this. The first is CECL now explicitly requires the use of forward-looking information. A term that you'll hear is reasonable and supportable forecasts of future economic conditions. So this is one big change, again, that's implemented with CECL, is this use of forward-looking information. The second piece that CECL changed was the removal of the probable threshold. So again, now under CECL, we're going to estimate lifetime expected credit losses at loan origination, regardless of whether or not those losses are seen as probable. So again, those were the two main changes from a high level that CECL led to. So I have this quote on the screen as well, which I think I've seen in just about every CECL paper that I've read. So it's a quote from the American Bankers Association that refers to CECL as the most sweeping change to bank accounting ever. So this was a very big change to bank accounting. And as a result of that, it's very, very controversial. So there have been a lot of debates about the costs and benefits of CECL, several calls to delay implementation of CECL, and in some cases, even remove CECL altogether. Just to give you a sense, we are over a decade removed from the financial crisis, which again was the impetus for these standards. And it's only at the beginning of 2020 where we saw these standards to start to be implemented. And again, CECL was passed in 2016. So we also had 4 years of lead time before the standards were actually started to be implemented. Again, gives you a sense of how big the standard change really was. So this was kind of the background that I wanted to get to in terms of the background on CECL, again, at a high level. So I'll kind of transition more specifically into what we do in our paper. And so at this point, happy to answer any questions anyone might have. Otherwise, either now or, like I said, as we move through the presentation. So kind of with this backdrop of this change with CECL, kind of our broad research question is kind of given this important standard, what are the impacts of CECL implementation on financial analysts? So we kind of view financial analysts as an important user of the financial statements, an important group to kind of understand how they are impacted by this big new standard. Right, so that's kind of our broad research question. More specifically, what we're going to look at is how CECL implementation affects the properties of analysts' loan loss provision forecasts. And in particular, we're going to look at three properties of those forecasts: forecast accuracy, dispersion, and coverage. So again, these are kind of our big picture research questions, kind of motivated again by the shift to the CECL model. Next, I'll just kind of preview our main results of the paper. So what we find is that using a difference in differences design or diff and dip design, which I'm sure we will talk more about as we go through the presentation, what we find is that CECL is associated with a deterioration in the properties of loan loss provision forecasts. So specifically, what we find is that CECL implementation is associated with a decrease in accuracy, an increase in dispersion, and a decline in coverage. Again, related to the diff and dip design, we find that our results continue to hold after a variety of what I view as very important robustness checks. As like I said, we'll talk probably more about as we move forward. There are a lot of challenges to the particular setting we're looking at. So I think these sort of robustness checks are really important for our inferences. And we also show that the main results vary cross-sectionally with proxies for the importance of CECL to the bank. So the other key finding that we have in the paper, not only do we find a deterioration in the properties of loan loss provision forecasts, but we also show that CECL is associated with muted stock market reactions to these provision forecasts. So we interpret that as market participants viewing these forecasts as less useful under CECL. So again, these are kind of the two main takeaways from our paper. Barrett, you have a question?
Yeah, and I hope it's not too noisy where I am for you to hear me. But I guess, and I think that you're aware of this issue, and I think you're trying to address it in the paper. But I guess I'm just wondering, like, to what extent do you think your results reflect a deterioration in financial analysts' understanding of actual credit losses versus just a need to recalibrate their model, right, for what the provisions will be, because they're not sure, necessarily what the firms will book as the provision, even if they still have an understanding of what the underlying losses are. I don't know if you could maybe comment on that.
Yeah, so I think if I can maybe restate the question, I think the question is this kind of a result of just kind of not maybe learning or not understanding exactly what will be coming out of the accounting system under CECL versus kind of if they're forecasting kind of actual economic losses, right? And is the disconnect a misunderstanding of kind of the true economic losses, or is this simply reflecting maybe not understanding what's coming out of the accounting system?
Well, right. And is it a problem that maybe resolves over time as they see the provisions that the firms are putting out, and now they have a better model to predict what those provisions are?
Yeah. So I will say, so we are, I think, able to speak to this a little bit. So this is something a little bit later in the paper, which I'm happy to talk more about. And obviously we're a little bit limited just because, like I said, CECL was just implemented in 2020. So we don't have a huge time series under CECL. But one thing we have looked at is kind of how our results change, or if they look different, looking at the 2020 versus 2021. So kind of splitting the post period to see, do we see kind of a learning effect over time, right? As analysts are adjusting their models, maybe they become more accurate, or some of these results kind of reverse as they learn more about the standard. And what we find in those results is that there is a slight reversal of our dispersion result. So if you look at 2021, the increase in dispersion, or the higher dispersion, is a little bit lower than what it is in 2020. But it's still there. So we do still see more dispersion in 2021, so later in our post period. But we don't see any difference in accuracy or coverage in 2021 versus 2020. So not only do we continue to find those results, but they're actually not statistically different across those time periods. So again, it's somewhat limited, right? Because we're only 2 years after implementation. But at least based on the data that we have so far, there doesn't appear to be kind of a learning or reversal effect kind of over time. That's certainly something we've thought about, and at least try to address to the best that we can of whether or not this is a reflection of just maybe a misunderstanding of how or what's going to be coming out of the accounting system once CECL is implemented.
Yeah, I have just one quick follow-up and just a thought, and I feel like I ought to know the answer to this question, but I don't. It's like, if you can get information on their, not just their provision forecast, but like their charge-off forecasts. I think they have charge-off forecasts in their analyst reports, but I don't know if SPGMI collects that. But I was just thinking, I was like, I wonder if there's any, greater dispersion or degrading of what they actually are projecting, their ability to forecast charge-offs, and not just like the provision itself. So anyway, just a thought, like, if you get that comment and you're trying to disentangle those two things.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that before. I think that's a good point. If we could get that data, certainly would be interested in looking at that. And I think the other thing kind of related to this point and it kind of relates to, in some ways, how we kind of develop our predictions, is the fact that there is some evidence, and I can certainly talk about that in some other papers kind of in this space, that does suggest that there is kind of, maybe for lack of a better word, a better information coming out of the accounting system in terms of the provision reflecting future credit losses under CECL. And so in some sense, it does seem that it would be possible that analysts could actually learn or have better information coming from the accounting system in order to actually predict the kind of true economic losses under CECL. It's not something that we've, I guess, explored to a great extent, but I think that idea, maybe looking at, if we can, charge-off forecasts or something along those lines, I think would be certainly interesting to think about. Joshua, I think, was next. Joshua, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Did you have a chance to check whether managers occasionally or most of the time include the provision under CECL as opposed to the incurred loss model as non-GAAP item?
That I am not aware of in terms of whether or not it's considered. So are you asking if they're providing kind of both pieces of information, like what the provision would be under CECL versus the incurred loss model?
No, whether they include as a non-GAAP item any of the CECL provisions.
I see. That I'm not aware of whether there would be anything associated with that. I'm just not aware.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Ayung?
Hi, Brent. I just have a comment on kind of like how do we interpret the results, right? The decreasing accuracy. I think one kind of like analogous thought I have is that under the incurred method, because the probable threshold and requires some triggering events, somehow analysts are forecasting some of those potentially publicly aware events. But after they use the CECL, somehow analysts have to forecast some discretionary managerial expectations, right? So one analogous will be like how difficult to forecast whether tomorrow it will rain versus whether Brent would think tomorrow it will rain. I think the second forecasting task is way more difficult. And that potentially is kind of correlated with why they are smaller coverage, because financial analysts just give up by forecasting specific idiosyncratic managers' expectation about future rather than the underlying economic transactions that potentially they are able to see or observe at the moment. So I just want to hear your thoughts on, I agree with these robust results, but can we interpret it as a deterioration in properties of analyst forecast, or it's just a very different kind of forecasting task before and after this new standard? So maybe it's not that comparable.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there's some things that we can, that I think we do maybe know, I guess based on other work kind of in this area in terms of how the accounting system itself is changing kind of after the implementation of CECL. So I think one of the concerns certainly is that CECL does provide kind of more discretion to the manager, and it's possible that managers are using this discretion to either manage capital or smooth earnings, those sorts of things. And so you may actually see a disconnect between kind of the economic reality and what the actual provision is under CECL, and that may lead to kind of this some of these differences that we see. I can tell you that there are some other papers out there, and let me see if I can even jump to some of these papers. So I have them kind of listed on the slide here. For example, the Guidal 2022 paper, Kim et al. 2022, and then Lopez Espinosa et al., which is looking at IFRS 9. So not exactly CECL, but kind of the IFRS equivalent. Basically, all of these papers kind of suggest that CECL provides kind of better information, either decision useful and new information to investors. That's kind of the Guidal paper. And then the Kim et al. Paper kind of shows that provisions under CECL better map into future loan losses. So I think those papers are somewhat inconsistent with this idea that managers, at least on average, are using this kind of in a more discretionary way. And it does seem that there's kind of better information coming from the accounting system. But to kind of maybe more specifically answer your question of how we interpret our results, I would say one thing that we haven't pushed too much on the paper is more on some of these kind of other interpretations. I think kind of what we face maybe in some ways is a bit of a trade-off, right? Where we've spent a lot of time to try to convince the reader that our results are actually driven by CECL and not other things. And by other things, mostly I mean the pandemic, right? And the onset of the COVID pandemic, coincided with the implementation of CECL. And I think that's a big challenge with this setting. But kind of as a consequence or trade-off of that is we haven't explored some of these other sort of possibilities. I can say, at least with the current results that we have, is not only do we document the change in forecast properties, but we also show a muted stock market reaction to forecast revisions. And so there does seem to be kind of from maybe investors' perspective, that these forecasts are less useful. At least we see a less of a stock market reaction to those forecast revisions after CECL. So I think that can at least help us in some ways kind of interpret this result as a deterioration in the properties of the analyst forecasts.
So I just have a quick follow-up. I think
Sure.
that when I read the paper, I kind of feel like a little confused about their prior studies. You say showing that this new standard is better or worse. I think it's a little kind of loose because other papers sometimes use future, for example, non-performing loans as a benchmark to evaluate this information system, or rank them, right? It just like, it seems that across different papers, researchers use very different benchmark. And then in your paper, you use managers loan loss provision pre and post, but other paper may use others benchmark to evaluate incurred versus the CECL standard. I think in terms of writing, just let's bring that up to kind of tell people, what do you mean that one system is actually more relevant or useful based on what criteria or what benchmark? Is the goal to forecast future non-performing loan, or the goal is to actually forecast the contemporaneous years managers loan loss provision? I think those are all very different forecasting objectives before we jump to the conclusion that which system is actually better or worse. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And certainly our focus in this paper is more about how this influences financial analysts. It's not necessarily to say which accounting system is better. But I think the kind of research that has been done, certainly there's this idea of kind of linking the provision into future loan losses. But the Guidal paper, as an example, in that paper, so that's full disclosure, something that I'm also working on with my co-author Bi Chin. So in that paper, we are actually looking at whether or not this information is decision useful for investors and to what extent that information is new to investors. And so it's not that we also kind of look at how it maps into future loan losses, but it's more about this idea of, is this information kind of decision useful for investors? So a little bit different sort of framework from that perspective. And again, I think that's kind of analogous to what we do in this paper in terms of looking at how investors are reacting to these forecasts. I think that's an important kind of piece of our evidence that, again, we're kind of documenting that investors are not reacting as strongly to these forecast revisions under CECL, which again, I think we use that as a way of interpreting this as a deterioration in the properties of the forecast. But I agree with your point. There is this idea of kind of what are analysts forecasting and what is coming out of the accounting system. and those two things may not be aligned. And I can certainly talk more about that, and in particular in the context of the Beatty and Liao 2021 kind of gets at this idea, and is actually something we kind of build off of in terms of some of our empirical predictions. So that's something I could certainly talk more about as well. All right, Yao, were you next?
Okay, thank
That
you.
was Yao, then Barrett.
Okay.
Yeah, my question is related to what you have just been discussing, and earlier on Barrett's comment about how to interpret the results. In particular, like my question is whether or not after CECL analysts can have a better understanding about the fundamentals of the firm, regardless of, because loan loss provision apparently becomes exposed. Apparently it seems harder to predict, but in terms of predicting the actual riskiness of the company, the fundamental of the company, like what Barrett suggested earlier, how for example analyst forecast is related to future charge-offs. I think this is I'm just curious, whether analysts can learn anything incrementally from this CECL adoption. And one of your tests seems to be looking at banks' earnings before provision, and you don't find any effect there. So does that suggest that analysts learn nothing new out of CECL disclosure? It seems that it only makes their forecast of loan loss provision worse, and it doesn't help with any other forecast. Can I interpret in this way?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so actually these sorts of thoughts, let me, sorry, I went the wrong way. Some of these, did I jump ahead? Okay, here's the slide I was trying to get to. So some of these thoughts I think are consistent with actually some of the, I guess, the tension that we're kind of building in the paper. And I think ex ante, we weren't totally clear in terms of what the impacts would be. And so, as I mentioned, we have some of this kind of emerging evidence suggesting that CECL does provide, like I said, loosely speaking, kind of better information about future expected credit losses. And so we think kind of ex ante, it's certainly reasonable that analysts would be able to use this information to improve their estimates of kind of the fundamental economic losses of the loan portfolio. And in fact, kind of building off of that idea, and I just mentioned the Beatty and Liao 2021 paper. So one of the kind of takeaways of that paper is that they find that under the incurred loss model, analysts were providing information about future expected credit losses above and beyond what the accounting system was reflecting, again, under the incurred loss model. And in fact, analysts were willing to trade off their forecast accuracy in order to provide that forward-looking information that wasn't coming from the accounting system, right? And so actually using this sort of idea, one of the, again, this is ex ante before we actually saw the impacts of CECL, I think one possibility we had in our minds is that basically now the accounting system would more closely reflect what analysts were already forecasting, which is more, or I would say closer to the true kind of fundamental economic losses, right? And so as these two things start to better align, we actually may see better forecasts from financial analysts. And so I think, your overall question of couldn't this actually lead to improvements? I think ex ante, we certainly believe that was a possibility. It doesn't appear to be the case kind of given our evidence. One thing I think related to this idea, and it may be worth kind of talking about a little bit more in terms of, especially given kind of the topic of, the ADP and thinking about, kind of policy implications, I think kind of relates to this, right? So we have these other studies kind of showing benefits of CECL, but kind of with our findings, we're showing that analysts, kind of their forecasting properties seem to sort of deteriorate. So the question is kind of how do our findings kind of fit in with some of these other findings? And I think one possibility, and again, this is something that we don't explore too much in the current version of the paper. And again, it's this trade-off that I mentioned before of trying to kind of convince the reader that these are effects of CECL versus, the pandemic or other things. It kind of, again, that trade-off kind of limits our ability. We're only able to do kind of so much in one paper, right? But having said that, I think one possibility is that there may be actually a substitution effect between the accounting system and financial analysts, right? So information that we used to get from financial analysts, like for example, information about future expected credit losses, kind of consistent with the Beatty and Liao paper, we now can get from the accounting system. And so because of this, there is the possibility of kind of this crowding out effect of private information from analysts, right? Now, we don't need financial analysts to provide this information, so there's less of a benefit for analysts to gather this kind of costly private information. And because of that, they don't gather that information, and that actually is what leads to kind of the deterioration in the properties of forecasts. And so again, this is not something that we have direct evidence of, but I think is a potential kind of story that would kind of connect all of these findings together. And I think this is a really interesting potential idea, something that we've considered maybe pushing the paper on as we revise. But I think this idea of kind of crowding out effect and a reduction in private information gathering by financial analysts is certainly a possibility kind of in this space. Barrett.
Yeah, so this slide kind of answered my question a little bit, or addressed the question I was going to ask, but I think I can expand on it a little bit because, I obviously know that the GE 2022 is one that you've been working on, and so I was thinking when I was reading this one again, it's like, how are you reconciling these findings in your mind? It's like on the one hand, you're saying decision useful information. On the other hand, you're saying it's harder for analysts. And I think I like potentially this idea of substitution, but I still don't know that because it's like, okay, maybe they just don't need this analyst information. Although with all the additional disclosures, that's a little bit hard for me to believe that analysts wouldn't have space to add anything there. But I still think there's still a gap to bridge in terms of it's useful for investors, but it's not useful for analysts. Like there could be the substitution. I get that, but I think that's something that you may need to kind of at least write about more and trying to understand. And A. Young was on this as well with, well, it's you're talking about two different things. One is fundamental, providing information about credit risk itself versus what the provision is going to be. But I think you'll need to do more to kind of reconcile that in the paper.
Yeah, I think
like
yeah, no, that's a great point. Like I said, it's something that we have not done very much in the current draft of the paper in terms of kind of pushing on this idea. I think it's certainly a reasonable possibility of what might be going on and how I've thought about kind of reconciling these findings. And like I said, we've certainly considered kind of pushing more in this direction. Again, reading the paper, you could probably tell that, again, our primary focus was more about kind of identification and addressing some of the challenges in this setting. But I 100% agree that this is, I think, something that would help kind of push the paper forward and help us in terms of overall interpretation of our results. Ayun?
I just have this crazy thought when Barry was talking. Like maybe you can kind of compare the coverage and the accuracy rate to other line items that actually required a lot of managerial judgment. For example, restructuring cost, impairment, right? Because that switching from incurred method to CECL changed the nature of this accounting system, and that actually changes the propensity for analysts to forecast. So how about compared your result pre-post to different line items that actually have a different degree of managerial inputs, and to see whether that actually potentially makes sense in terms of the changing the quality or the nature of system.
Yeah, so we do have something kind of along those lines. It's not necessarily individual line items, but we do have, and let me, I can switch to one thing that we have, I think, related to this, that I think actually is, so we think of this as kind of a placebo test, I guess, as a way, again, of related to identification. But one thing we do look at, we do have information about earnings before the loan loss provision in terms of those forecasts. And so we do actually document in the current set of results that we don't find an effect for the earnings before the loan loss provision, which again, when we think about in terms of CECL, CECL really is all about how we estimate credit losses and really should only affect the provision, but shouldn't directly affect other items like, basically earnings before loan loss provision. Now, we don't go into kind of specific line items like you suggested of, restructuring charges or things along those lines. I'm not sure what kind of data we might have to be able to explore those line items. But we certainly were kind of thinking along those same lines with this sort of test. Again, the way we thought about it primarily was as a way to help rule out, as one of many things that we try to do, to try to help rule out any effects of the pandemic. So the idea that we had was, if what we're documenting is simply the onset of the pandemic, you might expect the pandemic to also affect the earnings before the loan loss provision. Whereas again, with CECL, it really should only be about the provision itself. And so we thought this was kind of a nice falsification test to kind of look at that idea. But certainly something we can think about more of whether there are kind of additional line items or other things that we can look at, kind of related to this.
So Brent, I have no problem with your results. I think it's very robust and it's a very nice falsification test. I think all I'm asking is take a look at all the IBIS analyst data, and it's just to show us that how many analysts actually try to forecast those kind of like impairment or highly managerial discretionary line items, right? And that will give you a good benchmark about maybe after CECL, they don't tend to try to forecast those line items when managers have a lot of degree of freedom to actually change the input, right? And it's more about how do we interpret the result, right?
Okay.
Is that there's a declining accuracy rate. So what? We use the analyst accuracy rate as an input to their decision making. So all the other decision making you talk about, like actually, is kind of like is kind of shed light on the benefits of the CECL. I think here it's kind of hard to tell that a lot of people use accuracy or forecast directly into their economic decisions, right? And then this will be another way to interpret your result, is that look, their other line items are very hard for outsiders financial analysts to forecast, and then potentially the changing the information system just change the nature of the forecasting task, and that's why we see those results.
I see. I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Point well taken. Thanks. Barrett?
Yeah, so on this falsification test, I mean, I buy most of your results, right? Forecast, error, dispersion, all that. I'm not as sold as a young on this falsification test, and there's a couple of things.
Okay.
Like, you're trying to rule out that it's the pandemic. And I guess it makes sense. Like, it seems intuitive, right? That the pandemic would affect the credit losses because you don't know what's coming down the pike. And so maybe that could be a cause for the change in forecast or some dispersion. I am not as convinced that you would expect the pandemic to have significantly changed pre-provision earnings. Maybe it would, but I'm just like, if a big component of that is net interest margin, net interest income, right? It's like, okay, how did we expect the pandemic to affect that? Or is it other, elements of income and expense? So that's kind of one thing. And then on its face, I was like, oh, okay, no change in the coverage of pre-provision earnings estimates, but then I've looked at those pre-provision earnings things in SPGMI. It's usually a relatively smaller sample of banks that they have that for. But I also was thinking, so kind of what you're implying here is that they are forecasting pre-provision earnings, but not the loan loss provision. Which doesn't that imply that they're not forecasting net income?
Yes.
So like I'm not following how that would be the case. Like I feel like if you're gonna forecast net income, like if you're going to have a pre-provision earnings forecast, you're probably going to have a net income forecast, which implies that you have forecasted the provision.
Yeah, so to speak to that point, so that's certainly something that we've looked into. And so I think what you're referring to is kind of the panel A column 3 result. And one of the things that we looked into kind of specific to that is, can we interpret kind of our result as kind of a decline in coverage? Or is this really, so it's possible that the analysts are not providing a forecast of the provision specifically, even though they're forecasting net income. And so that actually could be part of the difference here, is that we don't have a specific provision forecast, right? So that's what we're seeing is kind of declining, but it's not necessarily the case that we see kind of a drop in coverage overall. So one of the things that we did do to kind of look into this, this idea, is we also just looked at the earnings forecast, right? The existence of kind of earnings forecast. And we even not only used, so our main analysis, we're using the S&P global database. We actually then moved to the IBIS database to look at EPS forecasts for these firms to see, is there a decline in earnings per share forecasts, right? So again, trying to get at this idea is this just, they're still forecasting, but they just dropped the provision forecast specifically, or are they dropping coverage altogether? So we have a table towards the end where we kind of look at these alternative coverage measures and do find that there is a decrease in the IBIS EPS forecast as well. So I think this is overall kind of a decrease in coverage. But yeah, why that column 3 panel A result is not also significantly negative is most likely, given this kind of sample of firms, that it is possible that some analysts are not providing a provision specific forecast. And so we may see in some instances, fewer provision forecasts, but not necessarily a decrease in other types of forecasts. And to also be clear, when we kind of construct these measures, so one possibility is that we could actually estimate what the kind of pre-provision forecast would be, right? So if we know what net income is, we know what the provision is, we could kind of calculate ourselves what that kind of implied pre-provision forecast would be. So we don't actually go through that exercise. So we actually require that data kind of be in the database, because there's also some potential assumptions we may have to make with that. For example, if the analyst is providing an earnings per share forecast, right, it's not kind of necessarily the raw earnings number, but it's earnings divided by shares outstanding, which also may be something that they're forecasting. And so what number would we use to convert that to kind of dollars of earnings, right? So there's kind of more nuance to that. But 100% agree with your point, and we've tried to do some of that kind of in later analyses. Your first point, to kind of go back to that, was, maybe with this falsification test, the pandemic does not actually affect earnings before loan loss provision, at least to the same extent as it would loan losses. And so I totally agree with that point. And so I think while this is certainly a nice falsification test in my mind, I think that possibility still exists. So I think, like, broadly speaking, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, and I think it's worth maybe just jumping to, are these challenges with the different approach that we take, right? Really the key issue is the way that CECL is implemented is that the treatment banks, or banks adopting CECL, are essentially larger banks, and the control banks, the ones that have not yet adopted CECL are smaller in size, right? And we also know that CECL adoption and the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic kind of coincide. So I think the main concern is that the pandemic differentially affected treatment and control banks. In particular, larger banks may have been more affected. One plausible story could be, larger banks are more exposed to, say, global sort of risks. And obviously a global pandemic may affect them to a greater extent, right? So this is really the big kind of concern that we have in the paper. And so certainly this falsification test is one way that we try to address that. But we actually have, which I can talk about all of these different things, but we have kind of a laundry list of things that we do. So we spend a lot of time and space in the paper. And so I'm certainly happy to talk more about any of these individual tests more specifically. But I think the broader point I would say is the earnings before loan loss provision falsification test is certainly one test that we do and may have some shortcomings, but I think we try to do a whole host of things, again, to try to rule out this kind of alternative explanation. Brett.
Hey, Brent, can you remind me that was it correct that there were some banks that had the option to defer or delay the implementation of CECL under the CARES Act? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So during this kind of time period, right? So the CARES Act was passed, I believe it was March of 2020. So after kind of the onset of the pandemic. Basically the way, and maybe I can jump to our kind of main research design to kind of illustrate this. So our main treatment group are banks that are not considered smaller reporting companies. So this is something defined by the SEC that basically non-SRCs, so public banks that are, again, not classified as smaller reporting companies, were required to adopt CECL as of January 1st, 2020. But then with the onset of the pandemic, in March of 2020, the CARES Act was signed into law, which allowed the opportunity for banks to delay the implementation of CECL until 2021. And then there was another, this CAA, which I forget off the top of my head what that stands for, was also passed then again, I believe at some point in 2021, that actually gave another option to delay until 2022. So I can tell you in our sample, I think there are, so we have 205 CECL banks, treatment banks. I think there are, I think it's 39 banks that did end up delaying CECL under the CARES Act. So the way that we kind of address that, or in terms of our empirical approach, is that we basically define our post period based on the quarter of adoption. So we go through and make sure that we know when the banks actually adopted CECL and define their post period based on when they actually adopt. So like I said, of the 205 treatment banks, there are 39 that ended up delaying implementation under the CARES Act.
Yeah, I guess that was my question is, for those that had the option, right, to do it right away versus defer, and I guess some of them had to do it prior to that election coming onto the table. But has any other papers modeled that decision yet? Those that the characteristics of the banks that are kind of early adopted voluntarily, if they had the option, right, to defer or do it immediately?
Yeah, so I'm not aware of any papers that have kind of modeled that sort of choice. I can tell you one thing that we have done in our paper, which may or may not kind of address this point. So we have looked at, and I don't think this is actually in the paper, but we have looked at like what happens if we just drop those kind of delayers, which seems to be kind of the common approach, or at least one approach taken. And so I do know our main results aren't affected by kind of dropping those that elected to delay. In theory, I guess in this setting, all banks, this may be kind of hurting my case, but I guess in theory, all banks had the option to early adopt. So even banks like in our control group that did not have to adopt until 2023, in theory, they actually could early adopt. And I know of at least one instance where a bank, I believe it was a smaller reporting company, did decide to early adopt at the beginning of 2021. I think I've seen maybe another paper in this space that has even found maybe additional banks that decided to early adopt. But that's not something that we have necessarily considered in terms of the modeling that sort of choice. And I'm not aware of necessarily a paper that has done that. Like I said, our main approach is just to define kind of our post period based on when the bank actually adopts. And then we do know that kind of dropping those banks that elected to delay does not affect our main results.
No, thank you. That really helped me kind of understand who's in the treatment versus the control group. Just one more quick follow-up, and because I think these analysts are looking at these banks not in isolation, right? They're comparing one bank maybe with their peers. And so that's just, again, one concern that popped into my head as I was reading the paper is, could your treatment firms just have more of a mixture? You know, some that are still on the incurred loss model because they voluntarily, you know, deferred that, some that are already on CECL. And so there's just more diversity, I guess, in what they're doing. There's less comparison groups, right? Than in the control group, there's maybe much more cleaner. Nobody's adopted yet. And so I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I think, so kind of related to that point, I think one thing that we do look at, like I had mentioned before, is we do kind of look across our post period. And so by the beginning of 2021, our CECL banks would have adopted. I think there were, I think of those 39 banks that delayed, I think there were 8 that did elect to delay again until 2022. But otherwise, all of the CECL banks would have adopted as of the beginning of 2021. And we do look at kind of that 2021 time period. And we do continue to find very similar results in that period, with maybe the only exception that we do find that the dispersion result is smaller. So the kind of higher dispersion, it's not quite as high in 2021, but in terms of our coverage and our accuracy results, they're not statistically different across those 2 time periods. So hopefully that kind of helps with that particular question. Jing?
I'll mute myself. So I think this is a very interesting investigation into the CECL impact, because I think one of the main comments about the CECL's impact is whether we trust manager, whether the manager is capable of making good estimates of their. So I think this is like from analysts, because it's the intermediary, it kind of touched that how the analysts trust their managers' words about their estimation of the probable loss. But are you thinking about looking into for what type of company? Maybe it's not the accuracy story, because the accuracy can be from the information from manager is not good, as well as the analyst analysis is not as good. But for the dispersion, it's more about whether we think take the manager's information as it is versus we do our own analysis as analysts, because we don't trust their word too much. Do you think that it would be interesting to looking at this aspect more by saying for what kind of manager analysts would think they are more capable of giving us good estimates, so we're going to take their words more, so the dispersion could be likely narrower? Is this something that in your mind that could possibly extend into?
Yeah, so that's not something that we have necessarily considered in terms of kind of maybe cross-sectional variation in terms of which banks we might expect to say have more incentive to kind of, you know, manipulate the provision under CECL and that sort of thing. One thing we have done kind of related to that, and let me kind of jump to this, is this idea of how to interpret specifically the dispersion result. I think this may help speak a little bit to that. Again, it's not exactly kind of your suggestion in terms of looking at kind of these cross-sectional differences of which managers do we trust versus not, but what is the source of dispersion, right? So we kind of do this BKLS, the Barron et al. Kind of decomposition of dispersion, with the idea being that forecast dispersion, kind of what they show theoretically, is that it's coming from the interaction of two sources. One is the consensus among analysts, so how much they kind of agree. And then the other is kind of overall uncertainty. So that first term, the 1 minus rho, is the consensus, or 1 minus the consensus. And this is kind of seen as how much private information analysts are gathering. And then the V term, the total uncertainty, represents kind of how much uncertainty there is from potentially public signals. So this is something that we kind of do. Here's how we calculate that. It's kind of consistent with prior literature. But what we actually find when we decompose the dispersion result is that this does seem to be driven by an increase in the total uncertainty rather than a change in consensus, which again, we think about as kind of private information gathering. And in fact, when we look, again, there's some additional assumptions you have to make to further decompose this into kind of public precision versus private precision. We find kind of a decrease in that precision of public information. So it does seem to be kind of driven by this, these public signals or this public information rather than a change in kind of the private information gathering. Like I said, that's about the extent to which we've kind of pushed on that angle. We can certainly think about whether we want to kind of push on this idea of, again, cross-sectional differences at the bank, of which ones we may trust more versus not.
Yeah.
Suggestion.
Yes, thanks for that. It's very interesting because I have this idea because I go to a AAA conference last week. I think some of the practitioners there from the bank analysts, they are indeed doubts whether managers are capable. So actually the results show here is given some evidence there. So they are indeed, the public precision is not as good, right?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And just a quick reminder, we have 4 minutes left, but people are welcome to stay on for more questions after the official session has ended.
Yeah, Joshua?
I always forget to unmute my microphone. This is maybe a strange question. I'm just not familiar with whether or not there's research indicating that investors really take the provision into account in their reaction. Is there such evidence? And if there is evidence that investors discount the provisions, does it matter that we have loss in accuracy of forecasts and greater dispersion? What may matter is just coverage. Am I confused about that, or? Yeah,
so one thing, and I guess this is something that is something we do kind of look at, I guess, in the Guy et al. Paper. We do look at, it's not necessarily the provision, just given the kind of empirical approach we take is a little different, but we do look at the value relevance of the allowance, both under the incurred loss model and under CECL. And we do find that is information that is value relevant to investors. And we also know, even based on prior work from Barrett, that even under the incurred loss model for unrecognized expected credit losses, that's something that is priced by investors. So that is something that that investors kind of do use kind of in kind of their decisions. I haven't necessarily thought about what that might mean in terms of what matters in terms of coverage versus kind of accuracy in dispersion. That's certainly something I can think a little bit more about.
Sorry, just a clarification, Brent. Are you saying that the provision, the specific CECL provision matters as opposed to the incurred loss? Is that what you're saying?
Right.
That there is such evidence.
Yeah. So at least, like I said, in the Guy et al. Paper, what we find, it's not necessarily the provision, but the allowance under CECL. We directly compare. So we actually use the day one impact. So basically, we compare the same bank at the same time under CECL versus the incurred loss model, and we do find that CECL is incrementally decision useful, I guess, or value relevant when we directly kind of compare those two standards. So
Thank you.
we do have evidence of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. It looks like I just have a minute left. I want to make sure to get the information for the next ADP event on the screen as well as I kind of conclude. But just want to thank everyone for your participation. Like I said, this has been a great workshop. I think we've got a lot of interesting feedback and looking forward to kind of improving the paper moving forward. And I will stick around for any other comments that anyone might have after the official session ends. But thank you all for your participation.